Removing the pan from the transmission, obviously all the bolts around the outside. Once you remove the pan itself, just before I do that, obviously the drain hole here, and this is where you're going to fill everything up. On the underside of the transmission pan, you can see where the drain bolt is there. The spot where the oil gets filled up to, you can see the actual line there where it would actually dribble out. There's a gasket and a number of magnets that pick up all the debris from the clutches, etc., rather than allowing it to continue through the oil. The valve body, you can see the connector at the front for the plug, which goes down to the solenoids at the back. There's a clip that pulls out here and then that just pushes straight out. There's another little thing here which actually has these little connectors on it, which actually bolt here, which hold the cable or the harness in place. On the underside here, this is the connector for the input speed sensor, which just holds into some little clips, or not clips, but just pushes into the valve body there, and then you can just press on the little tab there and then that'll be able to be pulled apart. The output speed sensor is on here, that's just bolt on, and again you can just clip or unclip those and remove the plug, and obviously all the solenoids along here. There are two different types. You've got the MV solenoids, which are the black ones, which are just an on-off, and you've got the green ones, which are the EDS solenoids, which are a variable solenoid to allow variable flow through the particular channels in the valve body. The filter itself, I've already removed that because I drained the fluid and pulled the filter out. The filter would actually be sitting over the top of this. It's got a couple of screws that hold it in there. That orange gasket is obviously from the neck of the filter itself. To remove the valve body, simplest way to do it is actually leave all the solenoids connected and take everything out with the harness. That clip that I removed there, then this just pushes straight in that plug, and then that can be pulled out. Leave all these connected. We're going to disconnect the input speed sensor and the output speed sensor, or you could actually just unscrew that and take the output speed sensor with it, but certainly the input speed sensor needs to be removed because it sits underneath the valve body, or it needs to be disconnected. And then to take out the valve body itself, you can see there's a whole load of screws on top of it. The vast majority of those actually hold the different pieces of the valve body together. You want to remove those that are the ones that are actually holding the valve body to the transmission case, and those are the large ones that have the T40 heads. So the others are a T27. So I think there's about 14 of those in total. I think there's 3 at the back here and 11 at the front. Remove all of those and then the thing will just pop straight out. If this is in the car and obviously upside down when you're doing it, you need to have something supporting this. Having done this a few times before, I just use a transmission jack with a jig that I made up, which actually holds all this up, and then I can just gently lower it down. You do not want to be trying to hold this up with your hands as you try and do this. Otherwise, because of all the finely machined faces on the other side, it's going to be fairly easy to damage everything, and certainly putting it back in again is going to be very difficult to do that accurately so everything's in the right spot without damaging everything or damaging anything at all. Something that I've always done in the past, if I was doing a pan drop and filter change, and try and change out as much of the fluid as I possibly can, because obviously a lot of it is in the torque converter still and up in the clutches, etc., up in the valve body. What I would do is those large bolt heads that are the bolts that actually hold the valve body to the transmission, I'd actually lower those all down about 1/2 centimetre or so. The valve body still hangs off the transmission case, but what it actually does is it actually allows a lot more fluid to come out. You'll probably get another couple of litres or so out of it, as it allows the clutches, which don't have much fluid in them, but allows them to empty out a little bit. But most importantly, it allows the torque converter to about half empty. So you let it sit there, especially if it's warm, leave it there for about an hour or so, and you'll hear it just glug, glug, glug out, and then eventually it'll just stop, and then you can just bolt, allow the transmission to be pushed straight back up into place again, and you're good to go. And once you've removed all those screws as well as disconnected the input speed sensor, I've actually just disconnected the plug here for the output speed sensor. Obviously, like I said before, you could just remove that out of there and bring it out with it. Then I'm going to just lift that straight out. And there's the underside of the transmission. There's the lead for the input speed sensor which sits there. We have a number of rubber grommets which actually press hard against the face on the other side of the other side of the valve body, and that's where the feed to the clutches actually goes. That's the same as these three back here. In addition to that, you can see the shaft which actually drives firstly the switch that sits on the other side of this, which tells it which gear it's actually in. So when you move the lever on this side, it also moves this shaft here, which engages the park lock down the back here, which is actually connected to the shaft that runs to the front diff. Looking at the underside of the valve body, got the solenoids all at the back here. We've got the additional EDS1 solenoid, which is the yellow one that sits in the upper rear valve body, and it's the one that actually controls the pressure to the entire valve body system. The ones at the back here control the pressures to individual clutches and also the torque converter lockup clutch. We've got the three ports that go to those rear clutches, and we've got those connections here where all those grommets actually sat hard against, and that would be going to the forward clutches and the torque converter clutch. To remove the plugs on the solenoids, people have problems with these. The way I do this, which seems to be pretty successful, I'm going to use a small quick tool, and what we're trying to do is lift this tab here to clear it of this little thing that holds it in, and then we're just going to wiggle it down. So I just generally push it a little bit forward. This is going to allow you to get that in there quite happily, and then once that's there, don't try and push this in too far. It just needs to be clear of it, and then we're just going to gently wiggle it. And once it's sort of clear of that knob, it will eventually just pop straight off. Removing the output speed sensor, there's a little bush in there that needs to go in. Removing the circlips and the springs at the bottom, squeeze together, and then the circuit comes out, and that spring will come with it. All three are the same. To remove the rubber tubes that go up to the clutches above at the top here, best way I found to actually do that is just use a pair of flag tip pliers, shove them in the middle and just gently give them a squeeze and a wiggle, and they will just pop out. These are the plugs that come out of each of these holes. The best way I found, because it's actually quite deep down in here and you need to get these out before the tower will actually come out. So I used a pick tool like this where I reach down, I've actually got that bent at an angle and it's quite sharp, so it goes in there and sort of digs in the side. Give it a twist first to get the thing sort of a little bit free, then put some pressure on it and it should just pull on out. With regard to putting the transmission back together again, most of it's pretty much identical to the standard rear-wheel drive version. The drive shaft is obviously fairly long, sticking out the bottom, so I've just got that in a woodworking vise to hold that whilst I put everything back together. This is the tower here. I've just shoved this on there for the moment, but obviously that would be out when you actually put it in the transmission. You can check each of the clutch packs just using a pick tool, making sure each of those steels, that last one actually is nice and loose so it's not actually jammed up, and also when you move them you can feel that they actually move nicely against each other, meaning the bearings are actually seated, not sliding around on the friction discs. The tower is different to the rear-wheel drive version in that you can see where those three plugs actually go to from the underside of the casing, the ones with the small ones with the springs on them. That's the big circlip which sits around here to actually hold the tower in. The rear-wheel drive version gets bolted in, this one doesn't. It just gets set in there and it stays put by a key which is on each side, which slots into some grooves along the side of the actual casing. On the top portion, including the pump, the way you set all this is up is pretty much identical. Prior to actually putting it in the transmission, you can see where those 5 rubber plugs press into from the underside from the valve body. One thing that is a little bit different is how you're actually going to check if all of these clutch packs here in the C clutch are aligned correctly. And hopefully I'll be able to show this on the video if I zoom in. You can see we've got, that's the actual piston there, we've got the wavy spring, the first of the steels, and underneath there you can see is orange is the first of the friction discs. Underneath that, if you actually look down, might be a bit hard to see on the video, but there's the groove there for the next steel, which actually run obviously on the inside of this piece here. To check that this is actually seated correctly and all of the clutches, so the friction discs are actually aligned, what we want to do is just hold onto that and actually turn, and what you should see is that last friction disc which is in there, we should be able to see that actually rotate around as we rotate the clutch below, and we should obviously see that the steel here and obviously the one underneath as well stay in the position that they are, and that means that that last friction disc is engaged properly with that clutch there, and then everything's going to be seated correctly. From there, actually putting it in the transmission is identical to the rear-wheel drive version. Some basics on the transmission. The output shaft comes out of this one here. There's an idler gear which sits in here, which then runs to a gear here, which then drives the shaft that goes to the differential at the front, which then runs a shaft from one side to the other with the differential on the right hand side to take power to the front wheels. The oil in the different compartments, obviously you've got transmission oil here, there's a gear oil in here, and there's actually a seal just on the inside here, so the actual shaft that runs through the other side and the bearings on the other side all get the automatic transmission fluid. All the way back here there's actually the forward part of the transaxle. There's 2 parts. There's the one here which actually holds those 3 the 3 gears here, and then behind that is another compartment that holds the torque and diff. The torque and diff component has gear oil in it, but those 3 here, as you can see from the red fluid here, they actually get automatic transmission fluid, and there's a seal about midway along this shot, actually sort of up here somewhere with the forward running shaft that keeps the transmission oil, which is in this section here, away from the gear oil, which is up in the differential section. The parking lock setup is different to the rear wheel drive. It actually locks the forward shaft here in here, and there's actually this piece actually slides back and forth. There's a big spring here which sits in there when you actually put the sprocket over the top, which pushes that in the forward position. When you rotate that, you can see we've got the parking lock piece here, and you can also see through that hole there, that's where the output speed sensor, you can see the impulse wheel for that. The parking lock itself is this one here, which just locks into there, and when you rotate the shaft, that's actually in the reverse position there now. You can see that would be sitting there like that, and it wants to spring load away from it, and if you rotate this to the park position like that, it actually pushes this down. This is actually held by that piece here, and that locks this into place so the car can't move. Removing the pump from this was a little bit different to the standard
5HP19 transmission. A lot of it's very much the same. Obviously I've removed the pump here now, but it sits underneath here in that sleek, I guess the oil pump and C-clutch assembly. A couple of things that are different about it. The pressure regulator is actually an integral part of it. It's pressed in there, and that's all comes part of the intermediate plate. So that doesn't get removed. But also, like the standard 5HP19 transmission, it's all the bolts around here that actually hold onto the pump. But on the standard 5HP transmission, there's just a single cheese head bolt here, which is the one with the round top in this deep recess here, which you have to remove. And all the others were to separate the intermediate plate from the stator shaft, when in fact on this one there's actually an extra bolt on the other side, and that all looks identical to the other ones that are holding on the stator shaft to the intermediate plate. The only way you can tell is it's basically directly opposite. It's a countersunk screw, the same as all of these, and there's no way you can tell. I was just kept on pulling them out until I found the long one. All of these are about 20 mil long, this one's 48 mil long, but easiest way to tell is it's opposite the cheese head bolt. So once you actually remove those two, then remove all of those around the perimeter, leave a few in like I showed on the other video, and just tap them down with a tool, and eventually the pump will just slot out the other side. Something I missed when I did the last project, inside here is actually a little sealing ring with an O-ring on the outside of it. So you need to replace that when you're doing a rebuild. So just get something and just tap on the inside here, that'll pop out the other side, and then you'll notice there's an O-ring on the outside edge of that ring which you can just easily replace and just push it back inside. This is the switch that sits on the side of the transmission, which turns when you change gears to tell it what gear it's actually in. And what's actually happening, what happens is this wiper actually moves and makes or breaks these contacts in here, which obviously sends a signal to the car to tell it what gear it's in. Pretty simple to pull apart. This cover just sits on the top there. You just drill the rivets out and pull it open. This car a number of years ago had a problem of the car going into limp mode at a time when it had just been sitting there for a while, and the way I fixed it up was actually just to put it in gear, or actually turn the engine off and just get my wife to actually just go back and forth between all the gears to about 100 times or so, just to clean all the contacts up, and that actually fixed the problem. That was a number of years ago. I've never had a problem since. However, since opening this up, it was fairly obvious that one of the contacts here was completely covered in gunk. So it's pretty simple actually clean these up. You just pull the wiper out and then just clean up everything. There's a little bit of grease and everything to make everything slide, so just make sure you don't wash all that away, and then you just plonk back in there. I've just got a multimeter and checked all the contacts to check that everything works as you actually move the wiper back and forth, and then obviously you can just plonk that on. You can either rivet it back on. All I'm using are pretty simple, just 4mm screws, which are right length. They're about 12mm long, and they work perfectly to actually just hold everything back together again. Getting the rear tower portion of the transmission back in is probably a little bit harder than the rear-wheel drive version. Firstly, because the holes in here are smaller, so you don't have the ability to shove, unless you've got really small hands, down through the gaps there to help you out. Also, everything seemed to fall apart a lot more easily, so what I ended up coming up with, which seemed to work reasonably well, was, you can see the transmission, I've actually got it on the stand that I made so I could sit it on its end, but it's at an angle pointing slightly upwards towards the rear, and that enabled me to actually shove my hand in through here, hold onto it and put it up there as far as I possibly could, so I could grab it at the end with my hand while sliding the two big keys down the side to not allow everything to fall apart, and that seemed to be pretty successful. Actually getting the big circlip in, actually gripping it without a special tool is, I found, difficult. The best thing eventually I used was a pair of long nose pliers, and that seemed to work really, really well. I tried circlip pliers and a whole bunch of things, and it kept on slipping off, so long nose pliers seemed to be the way to go. This is the front differential setup. On the right hand side of the transmission, the way you get all of this out is initially the output shaft. This is a single bolt. Remove that, and then it just slides straight out. and then remove the outside bolts, and then you can pull the cover off that right hand side straight away. You can see the seal on this side which seals to that output shaft. On the inside, things that you'll see, the O-ring which seals it to the transmission casing. There is a baffle here, and it's held in by 3 screws. You can just pull that out straight away. On the inside of that is a signal, typical ZF magnet. Other things you can see the fill screw here. There isn't a drain plug, which is a bit of a pain. In the past, to actually get this out, would actually drain the fluid from here. What I've done is I've just used a thin tube, probably about 6mm outside diameter, and all you're going to do is feed it in and actually push it down the inside of the baffle here. It only needs to go down about 10 centimetres or so. You don't want to push it all the way around here. So it sits down the bottom here, and then let it siphon out. And it'll sit there for an hour or so, but it will eventually, or most of it will come out. When I did this last time, I actually did it twice because there's about 0.8 of a litre of fluid in there. I got about 0.7 out each time by using this method. Did it a couple of times, and obviously you're changing over most of the fluid when you do that. Also on the inside here, make sure you hold onto, there's a shim, which is that piece there which sits in that place, and then the actual bearing race sits there, whatever that piece of the bearing is actually called. That shim is obviously important and is the thing they've actually worked out in the factory exactly with the size of all the componentry, with the diff, etc., that is actually going to run the bearings at exactly the right tolerances, so don't lose that. That would be all bad. The differential itself, this is what you'll see when you first open it up and remove the cover. It obviously slots into there with that casing on the outside. That just obviously just pulls straight out. You have the bearing cone there, the differential itself, and on the other side is the bearing cone that goes to the the drive shaft for the other side, for the left hand side, goes out. Obviously the shaft that runs from rear to front in the transmission casing, from the back of the transmission, interlocks with this and turns the diff. Out the other side is this piece, which obviously runs underneath the bell housing. There's this piece here which interlocks or slots into the differential itself. You got a piece here which actually has a seal on the inside casing, because on this side here you've got gear oil, and on this side here you have transmission oil. You've got a bearing on the other side here, and to remove this is pretty simple. You just remove the bolts around the perimeter here, and that whole thing just pops straight out. There's a seal on the inside here which actually seals it to the casing itself. There's a little spring-loaded thing here that actually pushes against the shaft in the centre of the diff as well. Additionally, you have I think it's the speedometer sensor, which is this one which sits in here, that actually just pushes straight in. There's a couple of O-rings and this little plastic piece which is sort of spring-loaded. Once you push that in, it just rotates around, and the little knob here just sticks through the hole to hold it in place. This is the piece at the back of the transmission, in between the transmission housing, which would sit here, and that last piece, which is where the output shaft is and the torsion differential sits inside. At the top you've got the breather, which is for the actual transmission. On the right hand side, that comes off the actual shaft that runs forward from up here, about here somewhere, there's a hose that comes up, which is the breather for the front differential. This thing, if you want to clean it out, that just pulls straight out, and you can clean it out and push that back in again. Either side of that, you can see that the 3 gears that at the back of the transmission, the output from the transmission goes to here. Then, my apologies, the output for the transmission is from to here. Then the idler is there, and that's the one that actually drives forward to the front differential. There's obviously a seal in between the two, because the front here, which is where those 3 gears are, uses transmission oil. On the other side here is where the torsion diff sits, and all in here is gear oil. Other things to note on the left hand side, so I'll turn that around, the transmission, there's actually a little hole in here which actually goes, you can see there, to the seal, and it actually goes to the middle of the seal, and this is a double seal, there's one on each side, so depending on if this actually starts to leak, depending on the type of oil, either it's red if it's transmission fluid, or if it's light brown, if it's coming from the torque and diff area, it'll tell you which side of this is actually leaking. But the nice thing is, because of that, it won't actually allow it to leak into the other side and contaminate the other type of oil. It'll allow it to just dribble straight out. These are the 3 gears at the back of the transmission. This one here is the output from the back of the transmission here. You've got the intermediate gear here, and this is the one that actually drives the pinion shaft that runs the length of the transmission to the front. I've got the thing standing on the bell housing at the moment, but I removed this with it level, so in the normal position as it came out of the car. You can actually remove the cover here quite happily, nothing will actually fall out. This one here is actually sitting on the shaft, it's actually splined to it there, so it can't fall out. This is the actual output, the big long shaft that's out of the back of the transmission, and this one here is the actual gear at the back. This is the one that actually goes and splines into the torque and diff at the back, and this is the output to that actually drives the front wheels. When you pull to actually remove these, if it's sitting like this and that's down, then probably the best thing to do is actually lift that up, grab hold of this one here, lift this one up and just pull it a little bit this way, and that'll allow this one to come loose, and then you can pull that straight out. It's on the other side, it looks very similar to this, just with the bearing cone, and it'll just pull straight out, but it won't fall out all by itself until you actually move this piece here out just a little bit. On the underside of this one here is actually a spring which actually pushes down on a piece that sits inside or around the pinion shaft. On the underside of here, which I've already installed, is a shim piece which is about so thick, as well as another bearing. There's the cone bearing here, as well as the one that actually, it's an axial bearing that sits around the shaft. When you're removing all of these gears, it's pretty obvious which way this one goes. But these two, it's not quite so obvious. They say to ensure that you keep the same orientation, so the way it's worn in, you want to keep that the same, so just mark the rear of these prior to pulling them out, and obviously install them exactly the same way. The cover from now just plonks straight on and just bolts onto the back. This is the torque and diff at the back of the transmission. It actually slides onto those two concentric spline shafts on the inside. They need to be perfectly aligned, and I found the best way to actually do this was sit it down initially on the first set of splines, which is actually the inner ones on the inner shaft that comes out of the back, and then actually get hold of both of the output shafts and just gently twist them, and that'll align the two, because if that won't go on unless it's perfectly aligned, and then it'll just pop straight down. Then the top or the cover at the back can go straight on. Just about to attach the transmission to the engine. A couple of things that I made to make things a little bit easier, so the transmission just slides straight on. I've made a stand here with high tensile threaded bar to connect to those 4 points in the bottom of the engine, so I can level that. And I've done the same thing for the transmission, except this one's on a trolley, so I can actually move it around and slide it on really easily. And I've adjusted those at the moment, so when I put that together, and I had a couple of practice runs, so it just slides perfectly on with no resistance at all. There are two dowels which need to be fitted. This one here actually pulls out pretty easily, so just fit that, and obviously the one here, which is the one that goes through to the power steering pump. You got that big aluminium piece that sits over the top. Prior to putting the torque converter in here and attaching everything, I've rotated at the generator at the front, so this torque converter hole here is adjacent to the starter motor hole, so I can immediately have that in the right spot to start putting the bolts on for the torque converter. Other things that I really need to be careful of when I put in the torque converter
There are the two slots in here that go into the pump. Make sure that they're aligned perfectly. When they're in there, the distance here should be about 23 millimeters, I think, from that front rim instead of about 11. And also you'll be able to see through here, this is where the crankshaft position sensor goes. I pulled that out and I should be able to see there quite happily that it stays in the same position as I put in. If it slips out, you'll trash the pump the moment you start the engine. So once I've actually got the pump on, I'm going to look at the pump little locking keys, make sure that slot's in there, and then I'm going to rotate the torque converter so it actually aligns with the holes. So when I actually put it on, I can just bung those bolts in there straight away pretty easily, and then once that first one is in, then I can easily rotate it using the generator at the front, the bolt on there, to actually turn the crankshaft over and put in each of the torque converter bolts. When fitting the torque converter, that's when I found that made it much easier to handle it. Just get the torque converter bolts and just screw them in 1/2 centimetre or so. So you've actually got much more to hold on to, and also turning this to actually align the pump is quite difficult unless you can actually get a fair bit of grip on this. With that, initially I was able to get it in about that, so it's about 1 centimetre deep, and it took a fair bit of jiggling to align the pump, but it's fairly obvious. When you measure with a tape measure, that's about 27 millimeters deep, which is what you want. And when you actually look through the crankshaft position sensor hole, it actually is aligned just with the back of it, whereas before it was kind of aligned with the front of it if it's not engaged with the pump. So when I put this thing together, what I'm going to be doing is looking for the back end of the torque converter aligned with the back edge of that hole to ensure that it hasn't actually slipped off the pump. This is the gear selection switch on the left hand side of the transmission. If you need to replace this, because oftentimes the reason you'll end up with a limp mode condition is because this starts to fail. It's actually just a bunch of sliders which make different selections every time you change the gear. And so you can I've actually just pulled this apart and cleaned everything out and put it all back together again. This is normally riveted together, and I've just got those screws there holding that back together. But if you need to replace this, getting at this is a bit of a pain, but it can be done with the engine and transmission inside the car. I've removed the cover on the inside left wheel well, and I've removed the transmission support which sits here, and the actual transmission mount is just down there behind the subframe. You can't see it. To get at that, you want to remove this liner in here. You want to lift up the transmission, so support it with a transmission jack or something like that. Don't do it on the pan, do it on a more solid piece of the transmission. You want to loosen the bottom screws which are underneath the subframe down here, and then on both sides, and lift up the transmission about 1 centimetre or so. Prior to doing that, there is a heat shield which is just in here. You can have access to it from this side. To actually get access here, you actually need to remove the left-hand drive shaft just to give you some room to get your hands in there, etc. And then once you do that, there are actually 3, I think they're 8mm hex bolts for the actual engine, so the transmission support. You can get access to those after you remove the heat shield. They're a little bit of a pain to get out. The bottom 2 down here are not too bad, but the one up the top here requires a little angle, sort of universal joint type connector to get at, but you can get that off, and then once that comes off, it's pretty easy to access these. In addition to that, you can see right up the back here, this on the other side is a little ball, and there's actually a rubber sort of thing that hops onto that, actually little clip thing that sits over the top of that ball, and it takes a lot of force to get that on. With both hands, I actually couldn't get that on, and I was trying to do that with all the transmission support and everything in place, so hence the reason why I've ended up like this, so I can actually get in there with a little clamp and press the thing on. With the switch here removed, you can see I've got a little clamp here, and I've been able to squeeze the black thing which is at the back here, which is the connector that goes to the actual gear selector, and squeeze it on from the other side on the top of the little ball that's just there.